Night hangs over Cleveland like a thin, smoky curtain. A young boy walks home along a rutted road, his boots damp with mud, a ledger pressed tight against his chest. Behind him, the clang of rail cars, the hiss of steam, the glow of factory fires painting the low clouds orange. The air smells of ash, sweat, and something new, oil, burned in lamps in the windows of men richer than he has ever met. John Davison Rockefeller is not yet a titan. He is a clerk's son with a quiet stare, counting every cent, memorizing every debt. In the small kitchen of a modest house, his mother folds worn hands and tells him that God rewards the disciplined, the patient, the honest. Outside, his father, aloof, charming, often gone, moves through town like a shadow with a salesman's smile. Two Americas press in on the boy at once, one of moral duty, one of ruthless opportunity. Soon, barrels of black gold will move where his footsteps now fall. Steamships will carry his name across oceans. Politicians will whisper about him behind heavy oak doors. Families will curse him as a monopolist, even while the lamps in their homes burn brighter because of his kerosene. In the quiet of that young boy's bedroom, as the gaslights flicker and the floorboards creak, a question hangs in the air like smoke. What happens when one man decides to bring order to chaos and charges the entire nation a price for it? If stories like this speak to you, walk with us through the rise of power and consequence. Stay, subscribe, and let the light of history burn a little brighter. A boy of ledgers and shadows. The road was hard and rutted, and the boy's steps fell in a careful rhythm, as if even his feet knew the value of not wasting energy. Evening gathered over the fields outside Cleveland, laying a gray-blue curtain over fences and bare trees. In his hands, clutched tight against his chest, he carried a small ledger, worn at the edges, dotted with neat columns of ink. The wind slipped under his coat and stung his cheeks, but he did not hurry. John Davison Rockefeller had already learned that the world rewarded the steady more than the swift. From the road, he could see the faint glow of lamps through thin curtains, other people's homes, other people's dinners, other people's warmth. In a few windows, the light burned a little whiter, a little steadier. Kerosene, he had heard. It burned cleaner than the old oils, brighter than tallow candles. In those pale, sharp flames, a new kind of future flickered. But to John, it was still just a word, another item on lists that grown men argued about in counting houses and at market stalls. He watched the light and thought not of chemistry but of cost. How much did such brightness sell for? Who made money from each drop? When he pushed open the door to his family's house, the smells of the day wrapped around him. Boiled vegetables, a hint of soap, a trace of coal smoke carried in on his own clothes. The house was modest, its walls thin enough that winter always seemed to sit just beyond them, listening. Yet inside, his mother tried to build a fortress of order. Eliza Rockefeller stood at the table, her face lit by a small lamp, her hands busy folding worn linens. The lines around her eyes were carved by worry and faith in equal measure. "You're late, John," she said, but her voice was not sharp, only tired. "I stayed to balance the books," he answered, placing the ledger gently on the table as if it were something fragile. "I wanted to make sure everything was exact." Her eyes softened as she reached for the little book. She knew the numbers inside it were not only practice. They were his way of making sense of a world that so often refused to balance itself. Eliza believed in God's providence, in honesty, in hard work. She believed, too, that her son had a mind like a measuring rod, straight, precise, dependable. "God sees faithfulness in small things," she said quietly, tracing a line of figures with the tip of her finger. "You remember that?" He nodded, absorbing the words like ink into paper. Faithfulness in small things. It was a command, a comfort, and a promise all at once. From somewhere beyond the lamplight, from the darker edges of the house, another presence drifted in and out of their lives, his father. William Avery Rockefeller, Big Bill to those who knew him on the road, was a man of loud laughter and quick deals. He sold cures in small bottles, told stories in large voices, and walked through towns as if every door should open to him. To John, he was a figure of contradictions. sometimes generous, sometimes absent, always unpredictable. On nights when his father did return, the air changed. Boots struck the floorboards with a careless thud. A coat smelled of travel, of tobacco and strangers' houses. Coins clinked in pockets and tales spilled out about rich farmers fooled, curious townsfolk impressed, another batch of medicine sold. Young John watched from the corner, his eyes steady, as if he were taking an inventory not just of objects, but of character. "Remember, Johnny," Big Bill would say with a grin, tapping a finger against his son's shoulder, "the world is full of suckers, don't you be one." The words hung in the room like smoke, mixing uneasily with his mother's sermons about truth and righteousness. Eliza's Bible lay on the table, its pages worn thin where her fingers had traced verses about honesty, charity, judgment. Between those pages and his father's roaming shadow, John's understanding of power took shape. He learned that charm could push doors open, but discipline kept them from slamming shut. As the years passed, the boy grew taller, but his habits stayed close and tight. He kept lists, counted pennies, recorded every debt and every promise. When other boys wasted coins on sweets or drink, he held his small hoard close. He loaned money to neighbors and made a note of it, not from coldness but from a deep fear of ever being helpless. Poverty, to him, was not just hunger, it was being at the mercy of someone else's whim. In church on Sundays, he sat straight-backed as the minister's voice rolled through the wooden rafters. Words about stewardship, about using one's gifts wisely, seemed aimed straight at him. He listened, heart pounding a little harder whenever the sermon turned to parables of servants who multiplied their talents and were rewarded. The idea lodged in him like a seed. To increase what one was given was not greed, but duty. Outside, beyond the church doors, America was changing. Railroads carved iron lines across the landscape. Smokestacks rose where fields once stretched. Newspapers carried stories of strikes, of booms and panics, of fortunes found in grain, in rails, in cotton. Somewhere in the hills of Pennsylvania, men were beginning to pull strange black liquid from the ground, cursing and cheering as it stained their clothes and turned their hands slick. But for now in Cleveland, John's world was smaller. A desk, a ledger, a prayer before each meal. He wanted work, real work, the kind that would test his discipline and reward his patience. By 16, he was pacing floors, knocking on doors, searching for a position. Offices smelled of ink and damp wool. Windows rattled when carts rolled by in the street. At each doorway, he stood with hat in hand, voice steady but quiet, asking if they might need a clerk, an assistant, a boy good with numbers. Again and again, the answer was no. There were other boys, other names. His shoes wore thinner as the days passed. Still, each evening when he returned home, his mother's eyes met his with the same calm strength. "Try again tomorrow," she said. "The Lord helps those who do not give up." John nodded, but somewhere beneath the nod was steel. He would not be turned away forever. He believed that the world, like a ledger, must eventually balance. That effort would meet opportunity if only he kept walking. One morning, gray and chill, he rose even before the sun. The city was just stirring as he made his way down streets that smelled of wet earth and coal smoke. He had written a list the night before, offices, firms, merchants, each one a possibility. Among them, a name he had circled twice, Hewitt and Tuttle, commission merchants. They traded in grain, meat, and other goods that moved along the growing web of rails and waterways. It was serious work, work that touched the veins of the nation's growing economy. He reached their building as light began to spill weakly across the sky. Standing at the entrance, staring up at the bricks and glass, he forced himself to breathe slowly. This, he knew, was not just another knock on another door. This was a test of his belief that persistence could bend fate. Inside, he imagined the scent of ink and paper, the low murmur of men discussing shipments and prices, the shuffle of bills being counted. This was a world he understood, even if he did not yet belong to it. Behind that door were ledgers larger than his own, numbers that could shape not just a family's future, but a city's. He straightened his coat, smoothed his hair, and held his hat at his side. For a moment, the memory of his father's words brushed against his thoughts. "Don't you be a sucker, Johnny." Then, like an answering echo, his mother's voice rose within him. "God sees faithfulness in small things." Between those two warnings, he found his balance. John D. Rockefeller reached for the handle, feeling the cool metal beneath his fingers. He drew in a breath, not knowing that with this step he was walking toward a life that would change the very shape of American power and leave the world forever arguing over the price of his success. He pushed the door open and stepped inside. The office smelled of ink, damp wool, and the faint sourness of old ledgers. Dust motes drifted in thin beams of morning light as John stepped across the threshold of Hewitt and Tuttle. Men moved with purpose between desks, sleeves rolled up, voices low but quiet. CK. The soft scratch of pens, the rustle of paper, the occasional ring of a bell or clink of coins seemed to form a kind of music, orderly, measured, disciplined. It was, in its own way, a church of commerce, and the ledgers were its scripture. A clerk led him to a small, glass-partitioned office. Behind the desk sat a man with a trimmed beard, sleeves neatly buttoned, his hair already graying at the temples. This was one of the partners. He glanced up, eyes keen, weighing the boy standing before him. "You're here about the position?" he asked. "Yes, sir," John replied, his voice low but steady. "I can keep books, I learn quickly, I'll work hard." The man studied him in silence for a moment. Outside, a wagon rattled past, its iron wheels scraping the street. Inside, the clock on the wall ticked out the seconds, each one a small test of patience. "What experience have you?" "I've kept accounts for a small firm, sir," John answered. "And for neighbors, I can balance any ledger put before me. I do not guess at numbers." There was something in the way he said it, plain, without arrogance, that made the older man's gaze sharpen. In an age filled with speculators and dreamers, this boy spoke like a ruler laid against a crooked line. "You will start on trial," the man said. "Low pay, long hours, accuracy is everything. Do you understand?" "Yes, sir," John said again. Inside, something eased in him, like a knot pulled tight for weeks suddenly loosening. He had crossed the threshold. The work was not glamorous. Days began early and ended late. He sat at a high desk, shoulders aching as he bent over columns of figures. He learned to read the flow of goods as if they were sentences: corn, flour, pork, all moving along the new iron arteries of the nation. Prices rose and fell with the seasons, with gossip about harvests, with distant rumors of conflict. The city buzzed beyond the windows, but John's world narrowed to ink, paper, and the slight rasp of his pen. He watched everything. He noted which merchants paid on time, which delayed. He learned which customers were reckless, buying more than they could handle, and which were cautious, growing slow but steady. In his mind, each name on the ledger became more than an entry. It became a story about character and risk. Some men chased sudden gains, others built stone by stone. When he was paid, he did not celebrate. He did not scatter his wages in taverns or on new clothes. Instead, he wrote down every coin he earned, every cent he spent in his own personal ledger. His handwriting, small and tight, marched across the pages without flourish. On Sundays, he would look over his records and feel a quiet satisfaction. The numbers were growing bit by bit. He was building something that was his, and no one could take it with a single bad deal. Outside the walls of the office, the country trembled on the edge of war. Talk of secession and slavery hung in the air like storm clouds. Newspapers spoke of southern states breaking away, of Lincoln and angry crowds, of cannon that might soon thunder. In coffeehouses and on street corners, men argued about honor and union, about states, rights, and federal power. For John, the looming conflict was both threat and calculation. War could bring ruin, but it also brought contracts, demand, movement. Soldiers would need food, uniforms, supplies. Railroads would run day and night. Money would flow in powerful, dangerous currents. When the Civil War finally broke over the nation, its echo reached even the ledgers at Hewitt and Tuttle. Prices shifted. Risk deepened. Rumors of battles arrived on crumpled sheets, stained with travel and sweat. Men signed up, leaving empty chairs behind them. Drums sounded in distant streets, the beat setting mothers' hearts on edge. John did not rush to enlist. His sense of duty was real, but it was shaped by a belief that his greatest service lay in building something stable in a world coming apart. He paid for substitutes, men who took his place in uniform while he remained at his desk, managing accounts, seizing the business openings the conflict created. It was a choice that many would later criticize, a mark to some of cold calculation. To him, it was another entry in a ledger only he could see. Risk on one side, responsibility on the other. In time, the trial at Hewitt and Tuttle became steady employment, and steady employment became something else. By his early 20s, John had learned enough to see that working for others would never satisfy the restless balance sheet in his mind. He understood commissions, margins, shipments, and credit. He knew which suppliers were dependable, which buyers trustworthy. He had saved carefully, relentlessly. When the chance came to form his own partnership, he took it. Joining with a man named Morris Clark, he entered the world not as a clerk, but as a businessman. The sign on the office might bear two names, but behind the practiced politeness, behind the firm handshake, J. Owen carried an inner promise formed long ago over his mother's kitchen table. He would not waste his gifts. He would not return what he had been given without increase. Their firm traded in produce, grain, meats, goods that moved with the cycles of harvest and the marching of armies. Each contract was a step, each profit a reinforcement of his belief that discipline could bend chance. The war raged on, battles staining fields red hundreds of miles away, yet in his office, the ink running across the page was black and orderly. One day, in the midst of this chaos, a new word began to appear more often in letters and contracts: oil. Barrels from the fields of Pennsylvania, strange-smelling casks that leaked and stained wharves, began to move alongside his more familiar goods. Reports crossed his desk, wildcatters striking fortune or ruin, refineries springing up like weeds, fires that turned night skies orange. Men were making and losing money at a rate that seemed almost obscene. John watched at first with the same distant curiosity he brought to every new trade. But as more shipments appeared, as more clients added crude or kerosene to their dealings, something in him sharpened. Oil was chaotic, yes, dangerous, volatile, unpredictable. But beneath the chaos, he sensed a pattern waiting to be drawn. He ran his fingers along the rim of a sample barrel one afternoon, the metal cold under his skin. The stench of crude, sharp, earthy, almost nauseating, rose toward him. It was not pleasant, but he did not flinch. He thought of the lamps he had seen burning so brightly in the homes of the wealthy, the clean, steady light that seemed to cut the darkness more sharply than candles ever could. He imagined that same light in millions of homes, in cities and towns and farmhouses across the nation. Light, he thought, was not a luxury, it was a need, and wherever there was need, there was business. As the war in the newspapers darkened with casualty lists and grim headlines, another conflict began to form quietly in his mind, a battle not of bullets but of barrels. The men rushing to drill wells in the hills to gamble their futures on the chance of a great gusher were brave but reckless. They chased luck. John Rockefeller did not chase luck, he built systems. In the creak of the office floorboards, in the faint rumble of trains beyond the window, in the smell of burning coal and spilled oil, an idea was forming. If someone could bring order to this chaos, refine it, transport it, control it, what might that be worth? He closed the ledger before him and rested his hand on its worn cover. Outside, the world was tearing itself apart over old questions. Inside, on his desk, lay the first hints of a new age, written in ink and numbers, sealed in barrels and contracts. John Davison Rockefeller lifted his eyes from the cramped figures on the page and looked toward a future no one yet quite understood, a future in which black liquid from the ground would become the lifeblood of nations and the foundation of one man's corporate kingdom. The first refinery he saw up close did not inspire awe. It inspired calculation. On the banks near Cleveland, where the tracks met the water and the wind carried the damp breath of Lake Erie, a cluster of low buildings squatted under a sky stained by smoke. The wooden structures seemed almost temporary, as if a hard rain and a bad year could wash them away. Barrels lay scattered in the mud. Men shouted over the hiss of steam and the roar of fires, their clothes streaked black, their faces slick with sweat and oil. The smell was thick and choking: sulfur, smoke, raw crude, and hot metal. Flares of orange light leapt from open stills as oil boiled and separated, sending up bitter vapors that made the eyes water. Wagons rattled in and out, iron hoops clanking, horses snorting, hooves sinking into ground darkened by spills. To many it looked like the image of opportunity, a boom made visible, a fortune in motion. To John D. Rockefeller it looked like waste. He stood beside a man several years his senior, a quiet English-born chemist named Samuel Andrews. Andrews had a knack with the complex process of turning crude into kerosene and other products. What he lacked was money and organization. "The losses are terrible," Andrews admitted, wiping his hands on a rag that only spread the stain. "Spills, fire, we scrape by. Some days the waste feels as great as the profit." John watched a worker stumble as he rolled a barrel up a rough plank, the cask threatening to slip and crash. In that stagger he saw cost. He watched smoke billow from a chimney, imagined unmeasured fuel vanishing into the air. In that plume he saw cost. Everywhere his eyes landed, on warped boards, on careless handling, on sloppy storage, he saw the same thing. "With order," he said slowly, "you could make more from the same oil." Andrew studied him. "You think so?" "I do not think," John replied softly. "I know that wherever chaos reigns, someone with discipline can profit." The idea of entering oil refining was not born in a flash. It gathered itself around him, day by day, as letters arrived, as figures shifted, as he made quiet visits to more of these noisy, smoky places. He did not rush. He noted the cost of crude, the price of kerosene in different markets, the fees for shipping by rail or by water. He asked questions, listened more than he spoke. While others boasted of striking a rich well, he focused on what came after. Oil in the ground was a gamble. Oil in barrels, refined and sold, was something else. Cleveland, he realized, sat at a crossroads. Railways and lake routes made it a perfect hub to gather crude from Pennsylvania and send refined products out to the world. The war had already taught him how vital transport was, how profits slipped away when goods were delayed or damaged. If oil was to be tamed, it would be tamed in places like this. At home, in quiet moments, he weighed the decision as carefully as he weighed his accounts. The produce business was known, steady. Oil was wild, untested, dangerous. It had already made some men rich and ruined others. To step fully into it would mean risk unlike any he had taken before. He knelt beside his bed at night, the room lit only by a small lamp, and prayed. The floorboards were cool against his knees. His hands, clasped tightly, trembled just a little as he asked for guidance. He did not pray for wealth. He prayed for wisdom, for clarity. "Help me to use what you've given me," he might have whispered. "Help me to be a good steward." Before oil ever flowed through his pipelines, before the word standard carried fear and respect in equal measure, John Rockefeller had made a quieter commitment. From his first real wages, he had given a portion away. To churches, to causes, to people in need. He kept careful track of that giving, just as he did of his earnings, not as a contradiction, but as part of the same system. Money in his mind was never to be idle. It was always to be put to work, for profit and for purpose. The idea of entering oil refining took shape not only in his ledger, but in his conscience. Could he build something that would not only profit his partners, but bring stability to a chaotic trade? Could he turn a wild boom into a disciplined industry? The day he finally decided, the sky over Cleveland was a hard, clear blue. In the office he shared with Clark, the air was thick with the smell of paper and the faint tang of ink. The war still rumbled on in distant fields, but here, the battle was waged with contracts and railroad schedules. "We should move into oil," John said, his voice calm but firm. Morris Clark looked up from his desk, eyebrows lifting. "Oil." "Yes, refining, not drilling. The risk is high, but the demand will only grow. People want light. Factories, homes, ships, everyone needs it. And right now, the men handling it throw away half their profit in waste. We can do better." Clark hesitated. "It's a dangerous business. Fires, fluctuating prices. What if the boom collapses?" "What if it does?" John replied quietly. "What if this is the beginning, not the peak?" Silence settled between them, broken only by the ticking of the office clock. In that silence, the two paths before him seemed to stretch out, one safe and known, the other dark but glittering at the edges. He thought of his mother, of her sermons about courage disguised as faith. He thought of his father, of the way Big Bill took risks without care, relying on charm and quick exits. John would not be like either of them entirely. He would merge caution with daring, faith with figures. In the years to come, he would remember this decision as one of the turning points of his life. The moment when a young merchant chose to yoke his quiet discipline to one of the wildest industries of the age. Soon, a refinery would rise in Cleveland with his money behind it and Andrew's skill inside it. Wooden stills would simmer under watchful eyes. Byproducts others had ignored, like lubricants and paraffin, would be collected, refined, sold. Every spill would be studied, every leak addressed, every penny squeezed from every barrel. And beyond that first refinery, beyond the river and the rails, lay possibilities almost too vast to imagine. Networks of pipelines, fleets of tank cars, whispered agreements with powerful railroads. An empire, still invisible, waited for someone to draw its outline. John D. Rockefeller straightened a stack of papers on his desk, his fingers lingering on the edge as if he could feel the weight of the future already pressing down. The boy who had walked home clutching a ledger was now a man preparing to stake that ledger against the unknown. In the distance, a train whistle screamed, long and metallic, slicing through the city's noise. It sounded like a warning or an invitation. He chose to hear it as the latter. And as the first barrels of crude began to pour into his refinery, as the fires were lit under the stills and dark oil began its transformation into clear, potent kerosene, John Rockefeller stepped quietly into the current of history, not knowing yet that soon the flow of oil itself would begin to move at his command. Black gold and the making of a titan. In the oil towns of Pennsylvania, the earth groaned and spat like a wounded beast. Wooden derricks rose out of the muddy ground, thin and fragile against a low, smoky sky. Men in rough coats and worn boots sloshed through puddles of oil and rainwater, their shouts carried on the wind. At night, the hills flickered with torchlight, as if 1,000 restless campfires had been scattered across the slopes. The air smelled of sweat, whiskey, and the sharp, metallic tang of crude. News of each gusher traveled faster than the trains. Newspapers in Cleveland and New York printed breathless reports, wells that sprayed oil into the air like fountains, fortunes made in a week, land that had been nearly worthless now sold at prices that made old farmers shake their heads in disbelief. Men left shops, farms, and offices to chase the rumor of easy wealth. They crowded into boarding houses where the floors creaked and the walls were thin, their heads full of dreams and their boots full of mud. John D. Rockefeller did not rush to the fields. He read the headlines, studied the numbers, and stayed in Cleveland. Let others fight over who struck oil. He wanted to decide what happened to it after they did. In the refinery he built with Samuel Andrews, chaos became process. The building still creaked in the wind, the furnaces still roared, but under John's gaze the operation began to change. Waste that other refiners shrugged at became an enemy he attacked with the same quiet intensity he once gave to balancing ledgers. Barrels were stored more carefully. Spills were studied, then reduced. Byproducts that others threw away, paraffin for candles, lubricants for machines, were refined and sold. "Every drop has its purpose," he said one evening as he walked the yard with Andrews, the sky above them streaked with smoke. "If we do not find it, we are thieves from ourselves." Andrews glanced at him, half amused, half impressed. "Most men in this business think only of the next shipment," he replied. "You think of every penny." "Someone must," John answered simply. As the refinery's efficiency grew, so did its reputation. The kerosene that flowed from their stills burned cleaner than most, with fewer impurities, fewer explosions in lamps. Word spread quietly. Rockefeller and Andrews made reliable oil. Reliable oil meant fewer fires in homes, fewer accidents in factories, fewer nights ruined by smoke and soot. Customers noticed. Orders increased. Yet even as the business expanded, the wider oil world swayed like a ship on rough seas. When too many wells struck at once, crude flooded the market, prices collapsed, and refiners groaned under the pressure. When production dipped, prices shot up and panic gripped anyone who had promised more than they could deliver. Banks hesitated. Railroads raised rates, lowered them, then raised them again. Rival refiners opened and closed with the seasons. John watched this drama unfold with a mix of opportunity and distaste. The chaos offended him. He believed in steady lines, predictable returns, discipline. The idea that his fate could be tossed about by men drilling holes in distant hills felt intolerable. So he began to study not just refining, but the whole chain: wells, refineries, railroads, markets, ships. At his desk late at night, he leaned over maps and price tables, his lamp casting a tight circle of light over Cleveland and the oil regions. The country seemed like one vast, disordered machine, its gears grinding and slipping. What if, he wondered, someone could tighten the bolts? Railroads were the arteries of this machine, the carriers of crude to refineries and of refined oil to the wider world. They were powerful, yes, but they were hungry too. Empty cars ate into profits. Competing lines slashed rates, then raised them, then slashed them again, driving each other toward ruin. If someone could guarantee them steady traffic, they might return the favor with better prices. In closed rooms that smelled of cigar smoke and damp wool, Rockefeller began to make arrangements. He spoke with railroad men in voices so low that even clerks in the next room struggled to catch more than a word or two. Ledgers and timetables lay on the table between them. He offered what they needed most: predictability. In return, he asked for what he needed most: advantage, lower shipping rates, rebates, sometimes even payments on the shipments of his competitors if he could secure them. One railroad man years later would remember those meetings with a mixture of respect and unease. He did not argue, the man recalled. He simply laid out the figures, line by line, until it seemed foolish to refuse him. You felt as though you were not making a choice, but admitting a fact. With better shipping terms, Rockefeller's refinery gained a quiet, deadly edge. While other refiners struggled under high transport costs, he could cut his prices and still profit. Customers began to drift toward him like iron filings toward a magnet. Some did not even know why his kerosene was cheaper. They only knew it was. Inside Cleveland, the effects became visible. Signs for small refiners appeared, then disappeared. A family that had pinned its hopes on a little cluster of stills would find the market turning against them. One by one, many of them received visits or letters from men representing Rockefeller's interests. Sometimes the offer was simple: sell, join us, take shares, take cash, walk away from the risk and let someone else shoulder it. Those who agreed often spoke later of the strange mix of relief and regret they felt. One owner, his hands still slick with the scent of oil, might stand outside his shuttered plant and say, "It was him or the bank. At least this way I keep my house." Those who refused found the ground beneath them growing unsteady. They faced a competitor who could ship more cheaply, refine more efficiently, and undercut their prices without blinking. Some fought as long as they could. They took out loans, cut wages, begged railroads for better deals. But railroads, already bound by quiet arrangements, were more likely to shrug than to help. For Rockefeller, this was not cruelty. In his mind, it was necessity. There were too many refineries, too much waste, too much duplication. To him, consolidation was not a question of if, but of who. If he did not do it, someone else would, and perhaps without his sense of order and fair dealing. "I am simply building what must be built," he told one associate, his voice as calm as ever. "An industry cannot live forever in chaos." In 1870, the name he gave to this new structure carried a promise and a warning: Standard Oil. The word standard was chosen with care. It suggested reliability, quality, a fixed measure in a shifting world. But it also hinted at something else: a benchmark that others would be judged against, a line that others would be pushed toward or swept aside by. The company's charter was dry, written in legal phrases and neat clauses. But between those lines, something extraordinary was taking shape: a plan to bring as much of the oil trade as possible under a single, coordinated control. In the din of the refineries, in the clatter of rail yards, men went about their work unaware that a new kind of power was knitting itself together above their heads. They smelled smoke, heard the rattle of tank cars, felt the heat of the stills on their faces. They did not yet see the invisible threads running from Cleveland to the oil fields, to the docks, to the counting houses of railroads and banks. But John D. Rockefeller saw them. In his mind, those threads formed a web, and at its center sat a quiet man with a ledger, adjusting the lines, tightening them, drawing more and more of the industry into his grasp. And as Standard Oil began its rise, as the ink dried on new contracts and the paint on new signs, an unsettling question started to drift through the oil regions like smoke. If one company could set the standard for everyone, who would dare stand against it? On a chilly morning in 1870, in a plain office far from the noisy fields of Pennsylvania, a handful of men sat around a wooden table while a quiet revolution took shape on paper. The room was not grand. Its windows rattled when wagons passed. Its walls were bare except for a clock and a map. Yet what they signed that day would reach into homes and factories across the nation. The ink was still wet on the documents that formally created Standard Oil of Ohio. To an outsider, the charter might have looked like any other, a list of names, shares, responsibilities. But to John D. Rockefeller, it was the skeleton of something much larger. He did not clap his hands, did not raise his voice, did not boast. He simply folded the papers with care, as if handling something living, and placed them in a drawer. "This," he said quietly to a close associate, "will allow us to do in unity what others can only attempt in fragments." Unity, the word mattered to him. Oil, as he saw it, was not just a commodity. It was a test of whether order could conquer chaos. With Standard Oil, he meant to bring refining, storage, shipping, and eventually even production under a single, coordinated will. The thought did not thrill him the way a gambler is thrilled by a big bet. It satisfied him the way a perfectly balanced account satisfies a bookkeeper. Cleveland became his proving ground. Beside its tracks and riverbanks, one refinery after another puffed smoke into the sky. Some belonged to careful men, many belonged to hopeful ones. Their chimneys stood shoulder to shoulder, but their books told very different stories: missed payments, idle stock, LLS, wasted byproducts. In those small failures, Rockefeller saw his opening. He sent representatives with offers that were polite but not gentle. The message beneath the words was simple: join us or face us. A small refiner might stand at his doorway, hands stained, apron smelling of oil and ash, as the visitor explained. Standard Oil could buy his plant, absorb his workers, even grant him shares in the larger company. He could step away from the nightly fear that a price drop or a fire would wipe out everything he had built. "I started this with my own 2 hands," one such man might say, staring past the visitor at the chimney that had become part of his life story. "And you can see it live on under a stronger house," the answer came. "The market is changing. Alone, you will be crushed. With us, you can share in something larger." Some signed. They took the money or the shares, closed their doors, and watched as Standard's crews arrived to measure, dismantle, or rebuild. They went home with heavy pockets and heavier hearts, telling their families that it was better to bend than to break. Others refused. Pride, hope, anger, each played its part. They decided to hold out, certain that prices would turn in their favor, that railroads would relent, that some new well would swing fortunes back their way. They looked at the quiet man in Cleveland and told themselves he could not possibly keep growing at such a pace. But Rockefeller had already woven himself deep into the transport lines. When he moved oil, he moved it in bulk, in regular, predictable shipments. Railroads valued that. They rewarded him with lower rates, then with secret rebates on top of those rates. Sometimes they even paid him for every barrel his competitors shipped, a hidden toll that made rival shipments unknowingly feed the very company trying to crush them. This strategy reached one of its most ruthless expressions in a shadowy arrangement called the South Improvement Company, a pact between certain refiners and major railroads that would grant favorable rates and rebates to a select few while punishing everyone else. Contracts were drawn up behind closed doors. The ink on those documents might as well have been drawn from the veins of the smaller refiners who would be left to bleed. When rumors of the deal leaked into the oil regions, the reaction was explosive. Men who had risked everything on wells and stills read the terms and felt the ground tilt beneath them. Meetings were called in crowded halls where the air grew hot with anger and the smell of unwashed clothes. Voices rose, fists slammed tables, and words like conspiracy and robbery rolled through the crowd like thunder. One witness might later remember standing at the back of such a meeting, the floorboards shuddering under stomping boots as someone shouted, "They mean to strangle us in our own fields." The crowd roared in answer, a wave of sound that rattled the windows. Under pressure from this fury, letters, petitions, threats of direct action, the railroads backed away. The South Improvement Company collapsed before it fully took hold. On paper, it was a defeat for Rockefeller and his allies. But in practice, much of the damage had already been done. While fear swept the oil regions, Standard Oil had quietly secured key positions. Competitors, panicked by the prospect of being cut off from favorable rates, had sold out or weakened themselves in desperate maneuvers. Cleveland, once a city of many refiners, now found itself dominated by one. Later, this consolidation would be remembered by some as the Cleveland Massacre, a phrase soaked in bitterness. To Rockefeller, it was a grim but logical turning of the wheel. Too many refineries, chasing too little profit, had always been doomed. He had simply moved faster and more surely than the rest. "I did only what the situation required," he would insist. "If there must be a controlling hand, let it at least be one that values efficiency and fairness to the consumer." Fairness, of course, depended on where you stood. To the families who saw their signs taken down, their chimneys go cold, the new Standard Oil offices felt less like a blessing than a shadow stretching over their street. To the customers who bought cheaper, cleaner kerosene in distant towns, the name on the barrel mattered less than the light in their homes. At his desk, surrounded by maps and ledgers, John D. Rockefeller watched the numbers climb. Standard's share of refining capacity in Cleveland surged. Railroads still came to him, eager for his steady business. Bankers, once cautious, now saw in him a man whose ventures rarely failed. Outside, the world saw only pieces. A refinery closing here, a new tank farm rising there, kerosene prices quietly falling. Few understood how much of it traced back to the decisions of a single, disciplined mind. And in that mind, a new thought was taking shape, as relentless as any he had known before. If order could tame the ill trade in Cleveland, why stop there? Why not Pittsburgh? Why not Philadelphia, New York, the whole network of refineries that dotted the eastern states? If one city could be brought under Standard's steady hand, why not an entire industry? Maps began to cover his walls like quiet battle plans. Red pencil lines traced rail routes. Blue marks circled refineries. Small, neat notes in the margins recorded prices, capacities, names of owners. To most visitors, John D. Rockefeller's office still looked plain. No gold-framed paintings, no heavy velvet curtains. But if you studied the maps long enough, you understood. This room was where the oil world was being slowly, steadily rearranged. He did not do it alone. One of the most important men to join him was Henry Flagler, a wiry, sharp-eyed partner whose own past carried scars of failure and debt. Flagler had tasted ruin in a struggling salt business. He had watched promises collapse like bad scaffolding. Perhaps that was why he recognized something solid in Rockefeller's calm approach. "You plan as if disaster is always one step away," Flagler observed once, half admiring, half weary. "It often is," John replied quietly. "The difference is whether you face it prepared." Together they refined not just oil but strategy. Flagler had a talent for negotiation, a gift for reading people. Where Rockefeller's silence could unsettle a man, Flagler's easy manner could disarm him. They made a careful pair. One spoke little, the other just enough. At long tables piled with papers, they laid out their vision. Standard Oil would not simply compete. It would surround. It would build storage tanks where others had none. It would sign long-term contracts while rivals haggled month to month. It would buy tank cars, lease whole strings of them so that its product flowed smoothly while others scrambled for space. In the early 1870s, as the Cleveland Massacre and its aftermath reshaped the refining map, Rockefeller began to look beyond Ohio. Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, New York. Each city had its own cluster of refineries, its own local kings. But he did not see them as separate kingdoms. He saw them as disconnected pieces of a machine that could be brought under one control. Letters went out in his precise handwriting, or in the hands of his trusted agents. Offers were made. Meetings were held in hotel parlors smelling of tobacco and damp wool, in offices where firelight flickered against glass ink bottles. The language was often polite, but the logic underneath was hard as iron. "You have done good work here," a standard representative might say to a refiner in Pittsburgh. "But you are exposed. Prices move against you. Railroads give better rates to those who can guarantee volume. We can take you in. You may have shares in the larger concern. You may continue if you wish as manager, or you may retire with a profit now before the next storm." Some men, looking at their debts and their aging stills, agreed. They shook hands, feeling both relief and defeat. Others held out. They believed in their independence, in their local connections, in the pride of seeing their own name on barrels and buildings. But each time someone refused, the same quiet process followed. Standard tightened its grip. Better rates here, a new tank farm there, a careful lowering of prices in just the right markets. Customers drifted away, slowly at first, then faster. Bankers, watching the trend, began to look at the holdouts with more doubt, and at Standard with more respect. Inside the growing company, the culture reflected its founder. There was little room for waste. Lights were turned off as soon as they were not needed. Paper was used sparingly. Meetings were brisk. Rockefeller himself was punctual, reserved, rarely raising his voice. He did not slam fists on tables or shout threats. He simply laid out numbers. "If we can refine a barrel for less," he would say, "and transport it for less, we can sell it for less. The public gains. We gain. Those who will not adapt must either join us or step aside." To some employees, he seemed almost austere. He rose early, ate simply, avoided drink, and kept close track of his charitable giving as well as his profits. On Sundays, he taught in Sunday school, his Bible in hand, his voice gentle as he spoke to children about faith and duty. During the week, that same man signed papers that would wipe out businesses by the dozen. Does he ever doubt? A young clerk once whispered to an older colleague as they watched Rockefeller stride down a corridor, his steps quiet but unhurried. "If he does," the older man murmured, "I have never seen it." Yet behind the calm, there was strain. The work of drawing together an entire industry was like pulling a vast net against a strong current. There were panics, sudden drops in demand, fires that roared through refineries and turned night into a sheet of orange and black. Each disaster tested the strength of the system he was building. In 1873, a financial panic shook the country. Banks failed, railroads tottered, prices fell like stones. Businesses that had seemed solid crumbled in weeks. In that chaos, Standard Oil did not fall. It tightened. Rockefeller saw opportunity where others saw only ruin. Assets could be bought cheaply. Rivals weakened by the storm became more willing to sell. "The time to build," he told Flagler, "is when others are afraid to pick up a hammer." By the mid-1870s, the results were striking. Standard Oil controlled not just a handful of refineries, but a vast share of the refining capacity of the United States. Statistics, the dry language of power, began to whisper his dominance. In some regions, 9 out of 10 barrels of refined oil came from Standard. In others, even more. Ordinary Americans did not track these numbers. They noticed only that kerosene was cheaper and more reliable than before. Lamps burned brighter. Streets were lit longer. Factory shifts ran into the night. The age of light was spreading, and at its heart flowed a river of oil refined under Standard's watchful eye. But in boardrooms and back offices, whispers grew louder. Is there no one left who is not under their thumb? A small refiner in one city might ask another over a late-night drink, the lamplight casting long shadows on the wall. "They have the railroads," came the answer. "They have the banks. They buy when prices fall, they squeeze when they rise. How do you fight a man who is always ready while you are always catching up?" Even some allies felt a chill. A railroad executive, looking over contracts piled on his desk, could not help but feel that the company he depended on was also the company he feared. "If we cross them," he confided once to a friend, "we lose too much traffic. If we bow to them, we help them grow stronger still. It is like being tied to a giant. You ride when he walks, but if he falls." In Cleveland, Pittsburgh, New York, the same name appeared again and again in conversations held behind closed doors: Rockefeller. Some spoke it with respect, some with anger, some with something close to dread. And he, sitting at his desk beneath maps that now marked not just cities but entire regions, began to contemplate a new step, a way to bind scattered pieces of ownership and control into a single, hidden structure. A structure that could reach across state lines, beyond the easy grasp of local laws. The word for it did not yet fully exist in common speech, but soon they would call it a trust. And when that trust finally took shape, Standard Oil would no longer be just a mighty company. It would become an empire, one that lawmakers, journalists, and ordinary citizens alike would struggle to understand, and even more to restrain. The Standard Oil Empire. The papers that created the Standard Oil Trust did not look dangerous. They were just ink on paper, clauses and signatures, tidy lines of legal language that most ordinary citizens would never see. Yet as pens scratched across those pages in 1882, a new kind of power slid quietly into place, something larger than any one refinery, larger even than any one state. In a quiet room far from the roar of the stills, the trustees gathered around a long table. Oil lamps flickered above them, their glass chimneys faintly smudged with soot. Outside, the city murmured, carriages on cobblestones, the distant hiss of steam from trains, the low hum of voices drifting from taverns. Inside, the air was close and heavy with tobacco smoke and concentration. On the table lay documents from many states, charters, share certificates, deeds. Dozens of companies, each with its own board, its own name, its own line on some clerk's list. Standard Oil of Ohio, of New York, of New Jersey, pipeline companies, tank car companies, marketing firms. Together they formed a loose constellation of power. Tonight, that constellation would be pulled into a single shape. John D. Rockefeller sat among the trustees, his expression as composed as ever. He was not a man for dramatic speeches. He listened, hands folded, while lawyers explained the structure. The trust would hold the stock of all the scattered companies. The trustees, this small group, would control the trust. The pieces on paper would remain separate. In reality, they would move as one. "What we do here," one lawyer murmured, tapping the documents with a thin finger, "is give unity to what is already in practice under common control. We simply make it efficient." Efficient. It was a word Rockefeller loved. To him, the trust was not a plot, it was a tool. The oil business stretched across state lines, but state laws were patchwork, tangled, inconsistent. A trust, he believed, could glide over those borders, knitting everything together with an invisible thread of ownership. He signed where they put the paper before him. The nib of his pen scratched softly. It was not the sound of a cannon or a crowd, but it would echo just as far. And the years that followed, the empire took on a visible shape. Stand in almost any major American city of the 1880s or 1890s, and you could feel its presence. In New York, tall tanks loomed near the docks, their curved sides catching the gray morning light. In Chicago, long trains of black tank cars waited on sidings, iron wheels ringing as they rolled slowly into place. In Pittsburgh and Philadelphia, refineries spread like small cities, rows of stills, pipes, chimneys breathing smoke into the sky. On barrels, on letterheads, on delivery wagons rolling through muddy streets, the same name appeared again and again: Standard Oil. Deep inside this machine, the work moved with an almost mechanical rhythm. Crude flowed in from wells in Pennsylvania, Ohio, later from West Virginia, Indiana, and beyond. It traveled by pipeline, steel veins sunk into the ground, or in tank cars that bore Standard's marks. At refineries, it entered a maze of pipes and towers, where heat and chemistry split it into kerosene, lubricants, paraffin, gasoline, and more. From there, it traveled outward again, to warehouses, to merchants, to small stores on dusty corners in distant towns. In a little shop in Kansas, a storekeeper might lift a Standard kerosene can from a shelf, the metal cool under his calloused hands. The label was crisp, the promise clear: a clean, reliable burn. A farmer, standing on the other side of the counter, counted out his coins and carried the can home. That night, when he lit his lamp, the flame shone strong and steady over his children's homework and his wife's sewing. He sometimes cursed the railroad for its prices, sometimes the bank for its terms. He rarely thought about the company whose oil fed the lamp. In Rockefeller's office, that same flame was a number in a column, part of a flow he could see in his mind as clearly as if the whole continent were a single map on his desk. Reports arrived daily. How many barrels had moved along a certain pipeline? How much kerosene had shipped from New York to Europe? How many tank cars idled on which railroad? Prices, sales, losses, complaints. The paper rustled in his hands like the leaves of a great iron forest. He did not run everything himself. By now, no one man could. The trust had managers, superintendents, regional heads, each responsible for their piece of the vast machine. But the pattern of decisions, the logic of the whole, the push toward lower costs, higher volume, tighter control, ran straight back to Rockefeller's principles. Waste nothing. Plan for disaster. Cut your price, increase your share. In time, he told one colleague, his voice almost gentle, we shall refine the oil of the world. It sounded impossible, but as the 1880s turned to the 1890s, Standard Oil's reach extended far beyond American borders. Ships left American ports with tanks full of kerosene bound for Latin America, for Asia, for the distant glow of cities along foreign coasts. In dark villages half a world away, lamps were lit with fuel that had passed, invisibly, through the empire of Standard. Not everyone saw this as a triumph. In the oil regions, where the first wells had turned quiet hills into muddy gold fields, resentment festered. Independent producers grumbled that Standard's control of pipelines forced them to accept low prices for their crude. Small refiners who had not sold out lived under constant pressure. One night in a Pennsylvania town where the smell of oil hung even in the cold air, a group of producers gathered in a dimly lit hall. The wood stove crackled as men stamped their feet and shook off snow. On a rough platform at the front, a speaker pounded his fist on a table. "They fix the price of our oil," he shouted, his voice hoarse. "They own the lines, the cars, the markets. We drill, we risk, and they take the cream. Is this a republic, or are we tenants on Rockefeller's land?" Murmurs of anger rose, boots thudding on the floor. Outside, snow fell softly, muffling the sound once it reached the street. Anger lived in those rooms, but outside them, Standard's tank cars still rolled, its pipelines still pulsed. In distant state capitals, a few lawmakers began to take notice. They read reports that Standard Oil controlled the great majority of refining in the United States. They heard from merchants who said no rival could match Standard's prices, from small businessmen who complained they had been frozen out. "What we have here," one state official remarked in a private conversation, "is power that does not fly a flag, does not raise an army, yet bends railroads and markets to its will. How are we to measure such a thing?" The word monopoly crept into more and more speeches. Newspapers, fueled by both facts and rumor, printed stories of secret rebates, of companies bought overnight, of men whose fortunes had vanished in the shadow of Standard. Inside the trust, the response was not panic but adjustment. Lawyers studied new laws, structures were shifted. Ere one company name became too controversial, another might quietly take its place. The legal skin changed, but the nervous system beneath remained the same. Rockefeller, already beginning to feel the weight of years, saw all this with a kind of cool distance. He had long ago stepped back from some of the daily management, trusting others to carry out his methods. But the principle he clung to remained unshaken. Without a steady hand, the industry would fall back into chaos. Yet outside his circle, a different idea was beginning to form, a belief that this very steadiness had become a kind of stranglehold. And somewhere, at a desk lit by a single lamp, a woman leafed through old letters and reports, preparing to tell the story of Standard Oil in a way that would make the whole nation listen. Her name was Ida Tarbell. And with her pen, the empire that had grown in quiet rooms and along hidden rails would soon be dragged into the bright, unforgiving light of public judgment. Ida Minerva Tarbell grew up in the shadow of drilled hills and broken promises. As a girl in the oil regions of Pennsylvania, she had watched derricks rise like crooked crosses on the ridges above her town. Her father had worked in the business, building storage tanks, small pipelines, the humble infrastructure that made the early oil trade possible. He had felt the excitement of the boom, the pride of a man who believed he was helping build a new future. Then, as Standard's arrangements with the railroads tightened and schemes like the South Improvement Company cast their long shadow, that pride had curdled into anger. Contracts vanished. Rates shifted. Small players who had once stood tall found themselves pushed to the margins. Ida remembered her father coming home with shoulders bent a little lower, his boots tracking mud across the threshold. She heard the muttered words at the table, the names spoken with bitterness. Rockefeller, the railroads, the combine. Years later, as a journalist in New York, she carried those memories like old scars beneath neatly pressed clothes. She was not a woman given to shouting or slogans. Her weapon was patience. Her method was detail. When S.S. McClure, the restless publisher of McClure's magazine, suggested she take on Standard Oil as a subject, she did not leap. She considered. She remembered. Then she agreed. Her investigation began not with thunder, but with paper. In libraries that smelled of dust and old glue, she turned the crackling pages of reports and corporate records. In quiet offices, she coaxed stories from aging men who had seen the rise of the industry from its earliest, muddiest days. She traveled back to the oil regions, walking streets where the smell of crude still lingered in the air, and the talk in barbershops could still turn, in a heartbeat, to the old battles with Standard. "Do you remember when the South Improvement scheme came to light?" she would ask, her notebook open, pen ready. "Remember," an old producer might say, eyes flashing as if the scene had happened last week. "We thought they meant to choke us without even looking us in the eyes. Rates set in back rooms, rebates paid in secret. We stood there like men watching a noose being braided." Ida listened. She did not flinch from their anger, nor did she simply echo it. She asked for documents, dates, letters. Slowly a pattern emerged: the rebates, the acquisitions, the coerced sales, the legal masks worn by a single growing power. In an office in New York late at night, the gaslight hissed softly above her desk as she spread her papers out. Letters from producers, court filings, railroad rate schedules, corporate minutes in careful script. Each item by itself was just a fact. Together they formed a narrative, a story not of wild, heroic capitalism, but of a calculated march toward dominance. When the first installment of her series, The History of the Standard Oil Company, appeared in McClure's in 1902, readers across the country held the magazine in their hands, its ink still fresh, not yet knowing that the words inside would change how they saw corporate power itself. They read of secret deals, of the crushing of independence, of the way Standard had reached into railroads and banks, bending them toward its needs. Tarbell's prose was calm, almost clinical at times, but beneath the surface ran a steady current of moral judgment. She did not rant, she revealed. In parlors lit by lamps burning Standard kerosene, families sat together as someone read aloud from the magazine. In train compartments, businessmen turned pages with a tightening jaw. In the oil regions, old anger flared anew as people saw their private grievances laid out in print, given form and weight. "She has told our story," one former refiner said, his voice roughened by years and smoke. "Now let us see if anyone listens." Lawmakers did listen. Ida Tarbell's work gave them something they had previously lacked: a clear, documented narrative I could point to when they spoke of trusts and monopolies. The Sherman Antitrust Act had been passed back in 1890, but for years it had been a law more often cited than enforced, a promise more than a reality. Now, with public opinion stirred, that promise began to harden. In Washington, committee rooms filled with the scratch of pens and the low murmur of staffers as investigations took shape. Witness lists were drawn up. Subpoenas were issued. Men who once spoke of Standard Oil only in private now did so on the record, their words taken down by stenographers as the air in the hearing rooms grew hot and stale. Rockefeller himself became a kind of phantom in these proceedings, frequently discussed, rarely seen. His health, some said, was failing. He had already begun to withdraw from the day-to-day business, letting younger men handle the visible work while he tended to his investments and, increasingly, to his philanthropy. Yet even in semi-retirement his presence was felt. Cartoonists drew him as an octopus, its tentacles wrapped around state houses, railroads, the Capitol itself. In one famous image, the dome of an oil tank loomed over the U.S. Capitol, the Standard logo stamped on its side. The suggestion was clear. This was no longer just a company. It was a rival to the authority of the people's government. In state after state, lawsuits were filed challenging Standard's practices. In Ohio, in particular, the company faced a determined effort to break its grip. Courts heard arguments about restraint of trade, about combinations in the form of trusts that sought to control prices and markets. Lawyers for Standard countered with careful language. They spoke of efficiency, of lower prices for consumers, of the right of private citizens to arrange their affairs as they saw fit. They argued that Standard's size was not the result of coercion, but of superior service. But Ida Tarbell's words hovered in the background like a persistent echo. The public now had a story to match the statistics, a face, calm, bespectacled, relentless, to set against the bearded, tight-lipped image of Rockefeller. In one hearing, a witness was asked whether Standard Oil played fair. He paused, looked down at his hands, and then said quietly, "They played to win, sir, and they did not much care what the game did to anyone else." Outside the courthouses, outside the committee rooms, life went on. Lamps were lit, trains rolled, ships crossed oceans. Standard's oil still flowed through pipes and into tanks around the world. For most people, the trust was an abstraction. What they felt was the comfort of light at night and the sting of bills at the end of the month. The struggle over Standard's future seemed distant. Yet in the high chambers of the law, something fundamental was being decided. Could a republic that believed in free enterprise also accept a single corporate power that had, in practice, bent an entire industry to its will? The question rose slowly, case by case, through lower courts and appeals, caught in the gears of legal procedure. It gathered weight, wrapped now not only in Tarbell's narrative and state lawsuits, but in a growing unease about all trusts, in steel, in sugar, in railroads. By the time the federal government filed its great antitrust suit against Standard Oil in 1906, the giant was no longer just an economic force. It was a symbol, a test case. In offices from New York to Washington, men leafed through thick stacks of documents bearing the company's name. In Rockefeller's own circles, there was confidence, but also a flicker of something new, uncertainty. For decades, he had believed that numbers, planning, and discipline could conquer any market storm. Now he faced a different kind of force, a government newly willing to wield its law like a blade, aimed at the very structure he had built. And as the case moved slowly toward the highest court in the land, one question began to haunt both his allies and his enemies. Had John D. Rockefeller created something so powerful that only the full weight of the United States government could break it? The giant on trial. The courtroom was not built for legends. It was built for arguments. High windows let in a thin, cold light that fell across wooden benches, heavy tables, and faces turned forward in a tight, expectant silence. The air smelled of dust, ink, and too many people breathing the same breath. In that room there were no smokestacks, no tank farms, no humming refineries, only words, papers, and the heavy presence of the law. Yet everyone who entered knew that, in a sense, the whole sprawling body of Standard Oil had been called to stand here. It was the early 20th century, and the United States had begun to look in the mirror and ask what kind of nation it wanted to be. President Theodore Roosevelt, broad-shouldered and fierce-eyed, had spoken openly of bad trusts that needed to be broken, of corporations that had grown too large, too arrogant, and to be allowed to rule unchecked. Among those names, one returned again and again: Standard Oil. The federal case against Standard did not arrive as a single dramatic blow. It grew, piece by piece, like a storm front creeping across a map. Investigators gathered testimony. Lawyers assembled charts showing control and ownership, lines of ink that linked company after company back to the same quiet center. In offices in Washington, clerks typed long complaints on rattling machines, their fingers striking keys with a rhythm that sounded almost like a drumbeat. When the United States versus Standard Oil Company of New Jersey was finally filed, it was more than a legal document. It was a challenge. The government accused Standard of using its vast network of companies, rebates, and secret deals to restrain trade, crush competition, and control the price of a vital product. In the newspapers, the language grew even sharper. Headlines spoke of a monster trust, of Rockefeller's grip, of an empire on trial. Political cartoons showed Uncle Sam standing before a huge oil drum, arms crossed, demanding answers. Yet in the long, grinding process that followed, the man at the center of the storm was often nowhere to be seen. John D. Rockefeller, older now, his beard flecked with white, his hair thinning, had already stepped back from daily command. He spent more time on his estate, on golf courses where the grass was trimmed and the world seemed small and controllable again, and on the growing work of giving away parts of his fortune. Reporters, hungry for his face, chased him like hounds after a fox. They lurked at train stations, peered through gates, jotted down every word he spoke in public. "Are you afraid of the trial, Mr. Rockefeller?" one called out as he walked toward a train, his gait slightly stiff with age. He paused, adjusted his tie, and smiled a thin, chilly smile. "I leave such matters to the lawyers," he said quietly. "I have faith that reason will prevail." It was not fear that marked him in those years, but distance. The empire he had shaped now had a life of its own, and it was that structure, the trust, the holdings, the web of control, that now sat in effect in the dock. In the courtroom, witnesses came and went. Former employees, competitors, railroad men, clerks. Their words piled up like bricks, building a picture of how Standard operated. They spoke of rebates granted only to those who promised steady traffic. They spoke of rates that crippled independence while favoring Standard shipments. They spoke of offers to buy, firmly made and hard to refuse. Some spoke with anger, their voices shaking. Others spoke with a kind of resigned respect. "They gave me a fair price," one former refiner admitted, hands twisted in his lap. "But there was no choice in it, not really. They were in the railroads, they were in the banks. If I had refused, I would have been starved out." Lawyers for Standard pushed back. They pointed out that kerosene prices had fallen for years, that the public had benefited from lower costs and better quality. How could a company that made light cheaper for millions be called an enemy of the people? "Our success," one attorney argued, his voice smooth and measured, "is not the result of force but of efficiency. Others could have done as we did. They did not." The judges listened, stone-faced, as arguments washed over them. Behind their impassive expressions, they weighed not only statutes and precedents but a deeper question. When does size become danger? When does coordination become control? While the case wound its way upward, life outside went on. Electric lights began to replace kerosene lamps in big cities, yet oil remained vital, in factories, on ships, in countless homes not yet reached by wires. Automobiles, noisy and strange, appeared on the streets, their engines thirsting for gasoline, a once minor byproduct that now hinted at a new source of power and profit. In quiet rooms, Standard's executives took note. They were not just the kings of kerosene. They were poised to become the suppliers of the fuel that would power the age of the car. The irony was sharp. Just as the company stood accused of strangling one era's markets, it was already adjusting itself to command the next. Then, in 1911, the questions that had hung in the air for years finally descended in the form of a decision. The Supreme Court of the United States, seated in their high chamber in Washington, delivered their judgment. Their robes rustled softly as the words were read. The room was quiet enough to hear the scrape of a chair, the faint cough of someone in the back. Standard Oil, they declared, had violated the Sherman Antitrust Act. Its practices, its combinations, its use of rebates, its methods of crushing competition, went beyond the bounds of fair play. The trust, as it stood, could not be allowed to remain. The remedy they ordered was dramatic. Standard Oil was to be broken up, its integra. TED empire split into dozens of separate companies. The great web of control that had been drawn together over decades in quiet offices was now to be cut apart, strand by strand, under the watchful eye of the law. Newspapers across the country exploded with headlines. "Oil trust smashed," cried one. "Rockefellers empire divided," shouted another. In cartoon after cartoon, the great octopus was drawn with its tentacles severed, its reach finally checked. In boardrooms, in small shops, in the oil fields themselves, people repeated the news to one another like a kind of victory. The giant, they said, had been brought low. The republic had proved it could stand up even to a corporate king. On the day he learned the full details of the decision, John D. Rockefeller was not in a courtroom or an office. He was at home, in surroundings far removed from the muddy yards and smoky stills of his youth. The house was quiet, the air scented with polished wood and clean fabric. Somewhere in the distance, a gardener's tools clinked softly. An associate brought him the news in the form of printed words. Rockefeller read them, glasses perched low on his nose, his face composed. "So," he said at last, folding the paper with careful hands, "they have rendered their judgment." He did not rage. He did not shout. If there was pain, it hid itself behind the same control that had guided his business life. To some close to him, he seemed almost relieved. The long tension between his empire and the government had reached its peak. The verdict, harsh as it seemed, also brought a strange clarity. What few yet realized was that in cutting the giant into pieces, the court had not destroyed its wealth. It had multiplied its faces. Each new company, Standard of New Jersey, Standard of New York, Standard of Indiana, and many others, carried inside it a portion of the old empire's strength. Shares were distributed, markets adjusted. And the man whose name had haunted the whole case found himself, almost overnight, one of the richest individuals the modern world had ever seen. As the lamps burned on in cities and towns, as gasoline pumps began to appear like strange new sentinels on street corners, the story of Standard Oil seemed to have reached its great climax. Power checked, a titan humbled, the law affirmed. But for John D. Rockefeller, the ending of one kingdom marked the beginning of another. He had spent a lifetime learning how to gather and control wealth. Now, with the world watching and judging, he would have to learn what to do with it. In the weeks after the Supreme Court's decision, Wall Street did not sound like a battlefield. It sounded like rustling paper. In bank offices with marble floors and high ceilings, men in dark suits sat beneath buzzing electric lights, studying lists of names and numbers. Standard Oil of New Jersey, Standard Oil of New York, Standard Oil of Indiana, Vacuum Oil, Continental Oil. Dozens of companies that had once been limbs of a single body now stood on paper as separate creatures. Shares were parceled out, columns of figures adjusted, pens scratched, adding machines clicked. Yet beneath the orderly work of clerks and brokers, there was a tremor of something closer to astonishment. For years, people had asked whether the giant could ever be checked. Now, on the surface at least, it had been cut apart by 9 men in black robes. In the oil towns, the news brought a rougher reaction. Old producers gathered on porches and in barbershops, the familiar scent of oil still clinging to their clothes as they read the headlines. "So they've done it," one man said, tapping the newspaper with a gnarled finger. "They broke him." Another shook his head slowly. "Broke the company, maybe, not the man and not the money." He was right. In the strange arithmetic of corporate power, the breakup did not diminish John D. Rockefeller's fortune. It scattered it. Instead of holding great blocks of stock in a single towering trust, he now owned pieces of many companies that, freed to stand alone, would expand in new directions. The oil age was far from over. In some ways, it was only just beginning. On city streets, life seemed unchanged. Rail yards still clanged and echoed. Refineries still breathed smoke into the sky. Tank cars still rolled, carrying crude and refined products along the same iron rails. The names on some signs shifted, paint freshening the old letters. But the pipelines did not stop. The lamps did not go out. In Washington, politicians congratulated themselves on a victory for the law. Speeches praised the courage of a government willing to restrain private power. The Sherman Act, once doubted, now looked real. If Standard Oil could be forced to bow, then no corporation was truly untouchable. Yet even in those celebrations there was unease. Breaking a giant apart was one thing. Preventing new giants from rising was another. The modern corporate age had arrived, with its national networks, its vast capital, its reach into daily life. Standard had been perhaps the most visible example, but it was not alone. Steel, meatpacking, railroads, all had their own empires, their own kings. John D. Rockefeller watched this changing landscape from a distance. The fight that had defined so much of his public life, the argument over whether his company was a blessing or a curse, had reached its legal conclusion. Older now, his body thinner, his hair pale, he found his days shaped less by court summons and board meetings, and more by doctors' visits and careful rest. But he was not idle. Long before the final judgment, he had begun to turn his attention towards something that, to many, seemed almost as staggering as the fortune he had built, the fortune he meant to give away. Even in his hardest driving years, there had always been an undercurrent of giving in Rockefeller's life. As a young clerk, he had dropped coins, carefully recorded, into church plates, sent small sums to mission boards, supported his congregation's projects. To him, charity was not an afterthought. It was part of the same discipline that governed his business. Money, he believed, came with responsibility attached. Now, with his wealth magnified beyond anything that young clerk could have imagined, that sense of responsibility spread outward. On quiet streets in Chicago, the sound of hammers and saws echoed as a new university rose from the flatland, its foundations funded by Rockefeller's gifts. In New York, in a sober building filled with glassware and chalk dust, researchers at a new medical institute set up their microscopes, their work made possible by the same man who had once been drawn as an octopus in the papers. In black churches in the South, schools for African Americans, starved for resources in a segregated nation, received grants from northern boards in which Rockefeller's money moved, silent and powerful. These acts did not erase the anger of those who had seen their small businesses vanish in Standard's shadow. They did not change Ida Tarbell's pages or soften the memories of producers who believed they had been pushed to the wall, but they complicated the story. Was Rockefeller a villain who had strangled competition, a visionary who had brought order and efficiency to a chaotic industry, a devout man using his fortune to improve education and health, a symbol of the dangerous concentration of power in private hands? He was, in truth, all of these at once. On Sundays, the old Titan still attended church, slipping into a pew in calm, measured steps. He sang hymns in a thin but steady voice, the same voice that in youth had echoed in small Baptist rooms. When he bowed his head in prayer, people glanced at him out of the corners of their eyes, wondering what passed through the mind of a man whose decisions had lit and darkened so many lives. Sometimes he retreated to the wide lawns of his estate, where the sound of the world was replaced by birdsong and the distant splash of fountains. From a wicker chair, wrapped in a blanket against the morning chill, he could look out over a landscape entirely under his control, trees planted where he wished, paths laid where he directed. It was a smaller kingdom than the one he had once commanded, but it was his. And in the letters that arrived daily, requests from colleges, from hospitals, from churches and reformers, he saw another kind of empire forming, not of wells and refineries, but of institutions and ideas touched by his wealth. As he sorted through those appeals with the same care he had once devoted to contracts, as he worked with advisors to structure boards and foundations that would outlive him, the shape of his legacy began to shift. His name would linger not only on court cases and business histories, but on buildings, scholarships, laboratories, and causes. Some would praise him as a benefactor who had turned private gain into public good. Others would argue that no single man should ever have held such currency over the fate of learning and health. The same question that had haunted his business life, how much power can one person wield in a republic, now returned in another form. Only this time, the battleground was not the oil fields and rail yards, but the very soul of philanthropy in a modern age. And as the old oil baron moved further from the roar of refineries and closer to the quiet corridors of foundations, one final chapter in his story waited to be told, one in which fortunes were no longer merely made or broken, but transformed. Fortunes transformed, the Rockefeller legacy. The old man sat wrapped in a blanket on a wide veranda, the world he had helped reshape stretching out beneath a soft morning haze. The lawn sloped gently away, dew clinging to each blade of grass. Beyond the trees, a faint hum rose from a distant road. Automobiles now, not horse-drawn wagons, their engines burning gasoline refined by companies that carried his old standards scattered blood. John D. Rockefeller's hands, once ink-stained from ledgers and contracts, lay thin and veined on the arms of his chair. A nurse stood discreetly nearby. On a small table, a folded newspaper waited, headlines crowded with wars and strikes in markets. Somewhere inside, his name would likely appear again, attached not to a stock chart or a lawsuit this time, but to a gift. A new grant. A new institution. Another stone laid in the strange cathedral of philanthropy he had been building for years. He reached for the paper slowly, fingers careful, and opened it. There, between advertisements and dispatches from Europe, he saw it. An announcement that the Rockefeller Institute for Medical Research had funded a new laboratory, another attempt to pry secrets from disease. In Chicago, the university bearing his money continued to grow, its towers and lecture halls rising against the Midwest sky. In the South, schools quietly expanded their cramped classrooms, with funds channeled through boards that met in polished rooms far from the red dirt roads. Their money was meant to serve. He nodded once, almost imperceptibly. The numbers had shifted. Where he once counted barrels and shares, he now counted endowments and grants. But beneath the new ledgers, the old instincts remained: efficiency, planning, permanence. Give in such a way, he had told his advisors, that the gift continues to give long after we are gone. So they had devised mechanisms, foundations, boards, trustees, structures that echoed the old Standard Oil Trust in form but not in stated purpose. Where once he had combined companies to control a market, he now combined funds to direct charity. In both cases, the idea was the same: concentrate power, then use it with discipline. In a small town, a young woman stepped through the doors of a college for the first time, her tuition paid by a scholarship created with Rockefeller money. Her shoes clicked nervously on the stone floor as she clutched her books, utterly unaware of the long chain of oil, steel, courts, and controversy that had made her first day possible. In a crowded hospital ward, a doctor adjusted his spectacles and studied the results of a new treatment. Funding from a Rockefeller-backed institute had purchased equipment, paid salaries, kept the lights on late into the night. The patients on the beds did not know the name on the letterhead. They only knew the relief when a fever broke, when a cough eased, when a child slept through the night. Meanwhile, in an aging house in the oil regions, an old man whose small refining business had once been swallowed or destroyed by Standard Oil sat by his own window, looking out at hills that no longer sprouted derricks. His hands were rough, his savings thin. He had read the stories of Rockefellers giving with a bitterness that time had not entirely cooled. "So he gives it away now," he muttered once to a friend, the words dry in his mouth. "Always with his name on it. Buildings, boards, institutes. He spends what he made breaking us and they call him a saint." His friend shrugged. "The money does some good." "Aye," the old man replied, "but don't ask me to forget how it was got." Between these two men, the student stepping into her future and the refiner staring into his past, lay the full difficulty of Rockefeller's legacy. For every life brightened by his gifts, there were others who remembered the squeeze of his business methods. For every professor whose work was funded by his foundations, there were families who still told stories of how their fathers had lost everything when Standard came to town. The historian's task, like the documentarian's, is to hold both truths in view at once. Even within his own family, the legacy of power and conscience twisted together. John D. Rockefeller, Jr., his only son, grew up under the immense weight of a name that stirred both admiration and hostility. Where his father had been forged in scarcity and self-denial, Junior was born into comfort and into suspicion. Crowds jeered him at times simply for being his father's son. Yet it was Junior who took on much of the responsibility for guiding the vast philanthropic machinery his father had set in motion. He walked the halls of foundations, listened to reformers, read reports on tenement housing, labor conditions, education, public health. He watched, from a more sensitive distance than his father ever did, how corporate power and human suffering entangled in the industrial age. Sometimes the family's worlds collided in ways that made headlines. At Ludlow, in Colorado, when striking coal miners and their families were fired upon and killed in 1914 during a conflict involving a company tied to Rockefeller interests, public fury raged. Protesters carried coffins through the streets of New York. Junior, summoned to testify before Congress, faced the accusation that Rockefeller money had been bought with blood, first from crushed competitors, now from dead workers. Rockefeller Sr., watching this storm, saw the price of a name. The old conviction that efficiency and order justified hard measures could not shield his son from the sight of mothers grieving in the dust. In the years that followed, the younger Rockefeller would push for reforms in labor relations, housing, and working conditions, trying to prove that the family fortune could be used to mend, not just to build. Far from the mines and mills, another monument quietly rose that would come to stand as a symbol of the family's imprint on modern life. In the heart of Manhattan, on land others had doubted, Junior spearheaded the creation of a towering complex of buildings that would bear the family name, Rockefeller Center. Through the Depression years, while other projects faltered, steel skeletons climbed into the sky. Hammers rang, rivets were driven, concrete was poured. For thousands of workers desperate for a paycheck, the site was a lifeline. The city watched as Art Deco facades took shape, as sculptures were installed, as a skating rink appeared in the plaza below. Here, in the polished stone and gleaming windows, the history of the family seemed etched in architecture. Commerce and culture fused, offices humming with business above, murals and statues celebrating industry and progress all around. Tourists would come to marvel. New Yorkers would hurry through the concourse on their way to work, barely glancing at the name carved in bronze. Yet even there, among the lights and music and holiday crowds, the question lingered just beneath the surface. Was this a monument to generosity, to ambition, or to something more complicated, a nation's uneasy compromise with concentrated wealth? As the 20th century unfolded, the oil world itself changed shape. New giants arose from the shards of Standard Oil's breakup, companies like Exxon, Mobil, Chevron, different flags flying over the same essential business of pulling ancient sunlight from the ground and turning it into motion and heat. Wars would be fought with oil as a central prize. Economies would rise and stagger based on its price. The Rockefellers did not control these new empires as they had once controlled Standard, but their early structures, integrated operations, long-term planning, an understanding of pipelines, shipping, and refining as parts of one whole, set patterns that others followed. The corporate kingdom they'd pioneered had been broken by law, yet its blueprint remained stamped into the very concept of the modern multinational corporation. In libraries built with Rockefeller funds, students pored over books that analyzed monopolies and antitrust. In economics classes, professors used Standard Oil as a case study in both ruthless consolidation and remarkable efficiency. In law schools, casebooks printed excerpts from Standard Oil Co. of New Jersey v. United States, teaching each new generation of attorneys how the courts had tried to draw a line between fair competition and destructive dominance. The man at the center of all this did not live to see the full flowering of the world he helped shape. John D. Rockefeller died in 1937 at the age of 97, his life spanning from the age of candles and horse-drawn carts to the age of radio and skyscrapers. At his funeral, the pews were filled with family, business associates, philanthropic partners, and quiet faces whose lives he had touched in ways they might not have fully understood. The hymns rose, the words of Scripture were read, and outside, cars rolled by on paved roads, their engines humming on fuel descended from the black rivers he had once commanded. In the years after his death, the family name did not fade. It appeared in headlines about civil rights funding, environmental causes, political debates. Some descendants embraced the legacy, others tried to step out from under it. But whether invoked in admiration or in criticism, the name Rockefeller remained a shorthand for wealth turned into influence, for the double-edged power of private capital in a public world. If you stand today in a quiet corner of an old refinery site, where rusted pipes still snake through the weeds, you can almost hear the echo of those first experiments, the roar of furnaces, the shouted orders, the rattle of barrels. If you stand instead in a bright university hall built with Rockefeller money, listening to a lecture about biology or history, you can feel another echo, the hum of ideas set in motion by endowments that began as oil profits. The story of the Rockefeller family is not a simple tale of heroes or villains. It is the story of how one boy's terror of poverty and love of order hardened into a will to control, and how that will, expressed in ledgers and contracts, reshaped an industry, a legal system, and the very notion of what a corporation could be. It is also the story of how that same will, turning late in life toward giving, helped invent modern philanthropy, with all its promise and all its troubling cons. Entration of power. In the end, the Rockefellers did what so many Americans dream of doing, but on a scale almost beyond imagination. They forged a kingdom inside a republic, then tried to turn the walls of that kingdom into bridges. Whether they succeeded is a question each generation must answer for itself, in the light of its own lamps, under skies that are still, in so many ways, lit by the legacy of oil. At night, the city glows like a constellation pulled down to earth. From high above Manhattan, the towers of Rockefeller Center rise in clean lines and hard light, their windows burning against the dark. Far below, a crowd gathers around the skating rink, blades scraping the ice in a soft, constant whisper. Laughter spills up between the buildings, caught for a moment in the canyon of stone and glass before it fades into the winter air. A few blocks away, yellow cabs slide past gas stations where pumps click and hum, counting out gallons drawn from tanks buried in the ground. In the distance, tankers move along black water, their hulls heavy with crude from far coasts. Pipelines run under fields and rivers, hidden veins feeding the lit-up world. Almost no one on those sidewalks thinks of a boy in Cleveland walking home with a ledger clutched to his chest. But the line from his careful handwriting to this electric night runs straight, if you know how to follow it. Inside a university library funded long ago by Rockefeller money, a student sits beneath a pool of warm light, a stack of books open around her. She is studying climate science, tracing charts of rising temperatures, storms, and seas. Her scholarship bears the name of a foundation that began with oil wealth. Her research measures the cost of a world built on that same fuel. She pauses, rubs her eyes, and looks up at the ceiling. Somewhere in the back of her mind, she knows the word Rockefeller as part of a story about philanthropy, endowments, maybe antitrust law. She does not feel grateful or angry toward a man gone long before she was born. She simply lives for a moment at the intersection of his choices and her own. Across the ocean, in a small clinic in another country, a child breathes a little easier because a vaccine exists that did not exist a generation earlier. The lab that helped create it grew out of medical research that Rockefeller's wealth helped unlock. The doctor who listens to the child's lungs does not think of kerosene or tank cars or court cases. He thinks only of the faint, steady rhythm under his stethoscope. Elsewhere in a town still marked by abandoned mills and fading paint on brick walls, an older man walks past a boarded-up building that once housed a local refinery or distributor, a place swallowed up long ago by one of Standard's descendants or by shifting markets. He remembers his father cursing the trust, remembers newspaper cartoons of tentacles and oil drums. To him, Rockefeller still tastes of monopoly, of distant men making decisions that crushed local lives. These lives do not cancel each other out. They coexist, side by side like lights in different windows of the same building. Modern executives study Standard Oil as a blueprint: vertical integration, control of supply and distribution, relentless cost-cutting. Regulators study it as a warning: how power hides in subsidiaries and holding companies, in contracts and rebates and efficiencies that slowly erase choice. Activists see in Rockefeller's story a case study in how public pressure and journalism can bend even the richest fortunes toward accountability. In every debate over whether a company is too big, whether a platform or a retailer or a tech giant should be broken up, the ghost of Standard Oil stands in the background, silent and watchful. When courts weigh whether market dominance harms the public, they reach back, again and again, to the case that once carved Rockefeller's empire into pieces. And in every conversation about philanthropy, about billionaires funding universities, hospitals, social movements, his name returns in another way. Is this generosity or reputation building? Is it justice or a kind of private tax system where unelected men and women decide which causes live and which wither? Rockefeller did not create these questions, but he forced them into the open, simply by showing how vast a private fortune could become and how far its reach could extend. If you stand at dusk on a hill above any modern city, you will see the evidence of his age all around you. Highways threading away in red and white streams. Refineries on the horizon, their flares licking the sky. Ships gliding in and out of harbors. Planes carving thin white scars overhead. And beneath it all, the constant murmur of electricity, of pumps and engines and grids that grew out of an energy order he helped set in motion. Then lift your eyes higher, beyond the towers and the haze, to the dim outline of the stars. The oil that powered Rockefeller's rise was, in the quiet language of science, ancient sunlight. Forests and seas turned over millions of years into buried fuel. He was one man in that long chain, a late arrival who found a way to turn that stored light into money, power, and, eventually, libraries and labs and scholarships. He did not do it gently. He did it with ledgers and contracts, pressure and patience, faith and calculation. He believed he was bringing order to chaos. Others believed he was choosing who would thrive and who would vanish. Both were right. The Rockefeller family walked a narrow ridge between those truths, building and giving, consolidating and divesting, apologizing in some ways and defending themselves in others. Their story is not a neat lesson. It is a mirror. In it, we see what happens when a society opens the door to vast private enterprise and then struggles to define its limits. We see how a single life, shaped by a mother's strict faith and a father's wandering cunning, can leave marks on law, on business, on science, on the very map of a city. We see, too, how every fortune large enough to build a kingdom must one day answer to the world beyond its walls. Some nights, walking through Rockefeller Center as music spills from open doors and the plaza glows under winter lights, you might forget all of that. You might simply look up at the tower, its windows burning against the dark, and feel small beneath it. And yet, somewhere in the quiet between your footsteps and the distant hum of traffic, the questions linger like a low, steady note. Who should hold so much power? What do we owe to those who used it to forge the world we live in now? And when our age is judged in turn, what will they say we did with the light we inherited? From oil, from law, from wealth, from names like Rockefeller. The night answers only with wind between the buildings and the soft, unbroken glow of a city, still burning the legacy of a boy who once walked home in the dark, clutching a ledger, determined that he would never again fear the shadows.